with principles of ignition timing. And in order to have spark on any engine, there are three critical components: the battery, the ignition coil, and the distributor. Now, the distributor serves two purposes. One, as its name implies, is to distribute the spark to however many spark plugs or however many cylinders are in whichever engine that we're working on. But the other, more not as obvious cause of the distributor is to serve as a trigger to allow the ignition coil to send off of its spark. Now, an ignition coil, which is shown here, is nothing more than a transformer. Very similar to the transformers you see on telephone poles that are step-up transformers. This device, which consists of windings immersed in oil to keep it cool, take 12 volts or 6 volts from a battery and step it up to 20,000 volts so that it will cause a spark. But we need something to trigger that coil, and that is the breaker points that are within the distributor. In the diagram that we show here, we have our battery, which has a positive and negative terminal. The negative goes to ground, ground being common for all elements. The distributor, being mounted to the engine block, is also grounded. The positive end of the battery goes to the positive end of the ignition coil. The negative end of the ignition coil goes to the breaker points, which are also grounded within the distributor. This is what we call the primary circuit. When this happens and the breaker points are closed, note that I have them open, we'll get to that in a minute. But when the breaker points are closed, we are basically completing a circuit of positive flowing from the battery through the coil through the distributor. The distributor is grounded, which is also the other end of the battery. This is the very reason on these older cars you don't keep your ignition key on the on without the car running. When you're doing that, you're applying voltage through your primary circuit, and if kept on long enough, you'll eventually burn out your breaker points. Now, when the distributor is rotating around, there are lobes on the shaft of the distributor, one lobe for each of the cylinders. In this case, I have an octagon, which is 8 lobes for an 8-cylinder vehicle. When those lobes open the breaker points, it interrupts the primary circuit and causes the secondary circuit to activate. That secondary circuit comes out of the ignition coil and goes from 12 volts in the primary to the 20,000 volts in your secondary. So in a moment, we'll actually show these and the components as they exist and give a demonstration on how ignition timing works. So let's come take a look and see what these components look like. Over here on the bench, we have a distributor. This one in particular came from a Pontiac, but we're going to show you what all of the components look like that we had a few moments ago on the whiteboard. The first piece is, this is what we call the distributor cap. Now, these screws are slotted screws that, to take off the cap, you push down and rotate, and that unlocks the cap from the base of the distributor. There are 2 hold-down screws, one on each side of the distributor cap. When we undo those 2 screws, the cap will come off. Now, one of the things I'm going to point out here, and this is exclusive to GM, is this little window. This allows you to open that up so that you can adjust this screw, which adjusts the dwell of the points. We'll talk about that in another episode, but just a nice feature that is offered on a lot of the GM vehicles. After we take out our distributor cap, the next piece that we have is our rotor. Now, I've already loosened these so we can take our rotor off. I want to point out that the rotor is what we call keyed. We want to make sure that the rotor goes in like this and isn't what we call 180 degrees out, because that will affect our firing order. What you'll see is there's a little square notch down here on the rotor, which fits into this key up here on the distributor shaft. And they do this again so that when this goes in, you don't inadvertently put it in the wrong way. Now, one of the things to point out with this rotor is, again, this is a GM out of a Pontiac. The rotor that we're using on Vince's Ford is shaped a little bit differently, but it serves the same purpose. The center is what receives the spark from the ignition coil, and this part is what rotates around the circumference of the distributor to deliver or distribute that spark to all of the cylinders. Underneath the rotor is what we have, what we called our centrifugal advance, and these are weights, and these have already been designed and calibrated for the distributor in question. As this is spinning around at very, very, very high speeds, these weights will fly out and like a ice skating dancer does with centrifugal force, these will advance the timing. Again, we'll talk about timing and how that plays later on in another episode, but just wanted to point out what we have here. Underneath the weights, we have what's called the breaker plate. And on the breaker plate is where we have our contact points and our condenser. Now, from our whiteboard that we saw a few moments ago, the points are what open and close to serve as a trigger mechanism for the ignition coil to fire. The condenser is no more than an apparatus to keep those points from arcing out or causing damage from that spark jumping across them thousands of times a minute. So what we're going to demonstrate right now is what to expect and what to see when those breakers open and close. And we will get a little bit of that arcing action, which is to be expected. So what we're going to do is demonstrate how that spark occurs. Right now we have our positive side of the ignition coil hooked up to our positive side of the battery. Negative side of the coil is called the distributor lead wire. And that's what's connected right up here to our contact points or breaker points. Now, in this case, we have what's called a uniset, where the condenser is built into the points. Not my personal preference, but in a conventional set of points, there will be two separate components, your breaker points and your condenser mounted over here. Now, what's going to happen is our distributor is mounted to this vise, which I'm going to ground with this cable that's going to the battery. When that occurs, Pat's going to be able to look up in there, and between those points, as they are opening, you're going to see a spark, which should be completely normal. And hopefully what you are seeing is a tiny spark that's occurring between the contact points. Again, that's completely normal, and it is mitigated by the use of the condenser. Every time those points open, it's a breakdown in the primary circuit. That is the 12-volt circuit that's going from the battery through the coil, through the distributor, and back to ground. When those points open, it collapses the primary circuit, and it causes the ignition coil to fire. What we're going to show right now is how the ignition coil fires every time those points open. We have a wire going from the top terminal, or the secondary side of the coil, to this spare spark plug. I'm going to ground the spark plug on this vise, which will all be grounded. The distributor, the spark plug, everything will be grounded when I connect this lead. And as I rotate the distributor, we're going to see our spark plug firing. So I'm going to connect it. And now, as I rotate the distributor by hand, we see the spark plug firing. Every time those points open, the spark plug will fire. Now imagine, if you will, when the rotor is on top of it and the cap on top of it, the points again serve as the trigger mechanism to spark, and the rotor is what delivers that spark to however many spark plugs we have, which corresponds to the number of cylinders in our engine. And that is the fundamentals of how a distributor works. A couple of points to note on how this distributor works. First is this is what we call an old-fashioned or conventional distributor that uses contact points and condenser. In 1974 and 75, GM came out with what's called an electronic ignition, or HEI. Unlike the older style that uses points and a condenser, it uses a magnetic sensor that's built within the distributor to trigger the ignition coil to spark. So the technology that we are talking about here is only applicable to 1974 and older. It does not apply to today's vehicles. The theory is the same, that you need a spark to be delivered to each of the spark plugs in our car, but the trigger mechanism is what's different on today's cars. Another point of note is that you'll see that when the points are closed and we are making continuity in our primary circuit, it does draw some current. Now, when I touch this to ground right now, we don't have anything because our contact points are open. But if I were to adjust this such that our contact points are shut, we get some serious current draw in there. It's for this reason that you never want to turn your key to on and leave it there, because when your key is turned to on, you're energizing your primary circuit and putting an awful lot of current through those breaker points. If it's kept on for prolonged periods of time, and it doesn't take much, even up to a minute, you can start to smoke the points and eventually weld them together. So in these older cars, prior to electronic ignition, never put your key on and leave it there for prolonged periods of time, for it could ruin your contact points in your distributor.